Hi everyone, welcome back to the 6-week course in portrait painting and drawing. What I'm going to be showing you today, demonstrating, is drawing with graphite pencils on a white Bristol sheet of paper. Some of you are choosing to paint, some of you are doing this drawing, which is either is totally fine. The principles of drawing, both if you're using raw umber paint on canvas or if you have a graphite pencil in your hand or charcoal in your hand, the principles are basically all the same. But what I thought I would do is demonstrate for you how to get this portrait done drawing. So what I have here is, from the reference that I would have emailed you by now, is a printout that I just used my black and white laser printer for. And sometimes I do that just as a way to decide on my overall composition. What I have here is a 9 by 12 inch Bristol paper. You don't have to work that size. If you want to do a larger drawing or a smaller drawing, that's fine, as long as the proportions of the head are intact. This head is about a 3 3/4 inch head. So that's about what I'm going to be doing. It may get a little bit larger, a little bit smaller. One advantage to working from a photo reference, there aren't many advantages. It's always better to work from life for what your eye can see in terms of value and color and depth. But in terms of sort of getting somewhat of a sense of the proportion, if you're a beginner in drawing, you can use your pencil as a way to make sure, especially if you're doing it exactly the same size as what you've printed out, you can check yourself. So I don't advise, laboriously taking your pencil and making little tick marks. But what you can do is start your drawing, try to practice observing, but then you can always check to see if you're way off. That's if you're doing it the same size. If you're making it larger or smaller than the reference, then you can use some certain strategies that I can talk about in my next video. Okay, so let's get started. I myself am going to be working mostly from my laptop, which you can't see in the frame because I wanted to zoom in on the paper. But that's what I'm going to mostly be using, and I'll refer this back to this drawing to show you angles and so on. Okay. So first order of business is the action of the pose. So what I'm going to do is basically mark off top of the head, bottom of the chin. And I'm going to strive to do it about the same size as what we have in this photograph, that's this printout, okay? And the very first thing to look for is what we call the center line of the head, and you can find that between the eyebrows. That's a good place to look for it, as well as this area, which is called the philtrum. That is the concave space that's between the bottom of the nose and the top of the lip. You could use her hairline as well. Her hairline is a little bit too far to the right, but this would be a good indication of where the center line is. What the center line does, I'm just going to put that center line down, is it right away, if you're conceiving of the head like an upside down egg shape, let's say, it gives you an overall sense of the rotation of her head to our right, as well as somewhat of the tilt. So the center line, you can think of the center line as being more responsible for explaining rotation. So imagine like a little trickle of water going down her face, like that. The tilt of her head can be understood by understanding what's called the axis. So that's like if you imagine a steel axle going through, bottom of her chin and out the top of her head, that's going to control the tilt. So you can sort of analyze both center line as well as the tilt, which would be, out of the top of her head, bottom of the chin. Okay, that's going to give you the action of her head. The next step is I am going to put in a few extra lines that are done with angles and pivot points. And the reason for that is why I'm not using curves is because what I'm after is a sense of the angular structure of the skull underneath her head. So if I use too many curved lines, I'm going to miss out on that. I can always round off these angles later on if I want to. The other thing to note about these angles is that it's called enveloping, and that idea, the reason why it's called enveloping, is that it comes from this notion that if you had to cut out a two-dimensional piece of paper, like an envelope, what would it look like if you had to, you know, come up with these major angles? So that's why they call it enveloping. Okay, so in portrait painting, the outside shape of the head is going to be something that is going to really contribute to likeness, you know, very, very much. So that's why you want to put some of those in before you move on to another part of her face. Okay, so let's say I get a few more lines down to indicate the beginning of her head. Okay, I'm just going to move this over a little bit. This line got way too big. I can always erase some of these lines. And the next thing I'm going to do, I haven't committed to a whole lot at all yet, is the action of her neck. So while her head is going more of a tilt this way, the neck is cutting that way. So besides enveloping and center line and the axis line, another very useful tool for getting your drawing started is something called long lines of relationship. So what I'm going to do is look for action lines that run this way. And notice that her neck, while her head is going this way, her neck is cutting this way. And then last but not least, to just get the overall action started, from where the pit of the neck is going to be, her shoulders are running that way. So you can think of yourself as establishing three major center lines. One for the action of her and rotation of her head, one that's explaining the general angle and direction of her neck, and a third that cuts diagonally down this way to explain the angle and direction of her shoulders. So this is like the major armature, if you will, of the action of her pose. Okay, so proportion comes next, where now we start to hone in more and more on proportion. And one thing that I'm going to do first is establish what we call the thirds of the head. Okay, so from the center line, what I'm going to get is a sense of where from her hairline to where her top of her eyebrows are, top of her eyebrows to bottom of the nose, bottom of the nose to bottom of her chin. And so in that way, we're establishing top third, middle third, and bottom third. Okay, now if this is meant to be the same size as your picture, this would be a good time to stop and you could double check your proportions. So this head got a little bit too tall, probably in the chin. So I'm going to pull the chin up just a little bit. Okay, and then with the width, we're about right, you know, width from here to here. I'm going to come in a little bit on the right side and a little bit more for her hair. But this should basically, if I take this measurement and I replicate it here, that is about right. Okay, you can also do the same thing for the thirds. So let's say I want to make sure that I saw this correctly. I can mark that off. This is from bottom of the nose to the chin and replicate it here, make sure I'm okay. Then from the bottom of the nose to where her eyebrow is and replicate it here. And then last but not least, from the eyebrow to the hairline. So again, you don't want to get overly caught up in just copying, you know, and you know, slavishly mapping everything out. try to practice seeing these things through observing, and then you can check yourself to see how, if it went off too much, okay? So the thirds of the head are okay. The width to height is okay. Another thing you might want to check is the cheek to cheek measurement, so there we're all right, as well as from, you can do this with anything, bottom of the chin to the forehead, okay? All right, so next what I'm going to do is starting to establish some of the placement of her features. I'm going to work from the center line outwards. And what that means is that the first step is going to be to try to grab at the overall distance with a kind of like a V shape that's between her eyebrows. And the next thing is to get a sense of maybe the placement of her eye. Now, what I'm going to do is, rather than, again, really look for all the details of her eye, mostly what I'm going to try to do is establish a relative, placement of her eye, maybe thinking about some of the darker shapes that I see of her iris, also thinking structurally in terms of where the shadow shapes are, okay? So very lightly, I'm going to map out her eyebrows on one side to the next, just get a little bit more specific shape for the eyebrows, as well as mark off the placement of her, the corner of her eye, the two corners of the eye. And then again, if you're doing it the same size, you can take this and see if it kind of matches what you're thinking. In addition to the overall thirds of the head, one very useful measurement is going to be that the bottom eyelid, is typically the halfway point of the head. So that's something else that you can check. Her lid right here is just a little bit less than the top. So her head is a little bit taller than that. But if I take let's say from top of the head to bottom of the chin, and I try to, guess at where the center point is, from here to here versus here to here, I'm going to raise it up just a little bit more. What that gives me is where I know the bottom of her lid should really land, okay? And that's about right in this drawing. That's about right, because her head is a little bit taller than that. Okay, so next up is going to be for me to map out the placement of her mouth a little bit, the eye over here, and then her mouth. So if I found the general position of the corners of her eye from one corner to the next, I'm going to map out the eye. If I do one side, right, I'm going to pivot over and I'm going to just very gently indicate the other side, like that. And then map out just a little bit where the her iris might end up, very loosely and delicately, like that, okay? And I'm going to leave it there for now. Next up is going to be for me to map out a little bit of the bottom third of her lips. So from bottom of the nose to top of the lip, I can then, I'm judging the distance basically of the philtrum. Okay, bottom of the nose, top of the lip, center. I ask myself, which lip is thicker? So I've got top of the lip, center of the lip, bottom of the lip, right about here, top of the chin, bottom of the chin. Okay, so in that way, I am kind of mapping out the overall distance between these key points. All right. And then of course, again, we can measure. So let's say you could take it from anywhere. You can say, all right, did I get it right from bottom of the lip to the bottom of the chin? Okay, that's about right. Did I get it right from bottom of the lip to the bottom of the nose? So if this is the bottom of the lip, and they're basically matching up pretty well. I'm just going to erase some of these marks that weren't quite right. So next up, and notice there's no detail yet. I'm doing all of this, by the way, with a 2H pencil. And the reason for that is for me personally, what I want to do is not commit too soon. All right, I've got my center line, I've got my thirds of the head, and I've got some of these basic proportions mapped out. So now I'm going to go back to the outside shape a little bit, because the head will always look a bit awkward until you can relate what you've established on the inside with what's going on the outside. So this is the, I'm building more angles to get a sense of the jaw. Okay, so from here, jawline, and then jawline back this way. Okay, again, enveloping. Okay, so let me pull that chin down a little bit. Okay, next up is going to be finding, for now, is going to be finding the pit of the neck. So the pit of the neck right here is typically about the same distance as the bottom third of the head. So if I can take the bottom third of the head and kind of swivel it around, it's going to give me where the pit of the neck is. So bottom third, swivel it around, that's the pit of the neck, how long the neck is. And then checking with something that we call vertical alignment, it's giving me a sense of where does the pit of the neck line up vertically. And it basically lines up with the corner of her eye here. So if I put a sort of imaginary straight line, you can use a longer pencil for this, and you could use a plumb, by the way, if you have a piece of metal that hangs on a string. The gravitational pull will give you a true plumb line, something that is perfectly straight. And then from there, we're going to think about the neck like a cylinder. So I'm just gently mapping out the overall feel of the neck in terms of a cylinder that's rotated. And then again, trapezius muscle, that's the sort of triangular muscle that's coming from behind the cylinder of the neck. And we're going to think about that in terms of 3 major angles. 1, 2, and 3, down to where the shoulder is going to start. So from her hair, I'm going to relate the back of her hair to where her shoulder is. And this may have to move up just a little bit. If I do one side, I'm going to peek the other part of the shoulder out on that side. And in weeks to come, we'll continue with the shoulder. So my first action line that expressed the shoulders fell a little bit too low. Ideally, this line is going to really run through, once you establish the pit of the neck, that's where the action line should really be. And it's also going to help you to see where the shoulder is. Okay, so from here, you can think of the clavicle like lightning bolts, both the trapezius and the clavicle, in terms of 3 major angles. So with trapezius, it's 1, 2, 3. With the clavicle, which is the collarbone, it's like a lightning bolt going up 1, 2, 3. And on the other side, 1, 2, 3. Shoulder, I'm going to relate the shoulder off of the width of the head. Remember, long lines of relationship. And then last but not least, just to fill out the bottom of this drawing, where her blouse ends, I'm going to take a look with vertical alignment at where that is. And I see that kind of lining up vertically with the outside corner of her eye, which is going to come in a little bit from where I was. So using that vertical alignment, that's going to tell me where her blouse, that V of the V-neck, is going to end. And then I can just pull this over for now. And same thing from the inside. Relating this line off of the inside corner of her eye as well. And we'll deal with the rest of her body in the next demo. Right now, we're going to go back to the head for the final, our final discussion, which is how to get a sense of her lips, nose, and eyes. The way that we're going to do that, and ears, of course, is to think about shadow shapes. So what I mean by that is to really examine the overall shadow shape. This is what we call the terminator line. That's where light, if light's coming from here, light ends and shadow begins. The unity and strength of these shadow shapes is going to give us more and more of her likeness. So the rightness of her face is going to heavily depend on that, the rightness of those shadow shapes. So let me show you what I mean by that. What I'm going to do, by the way, is I can start to get rid of a little bit of these marks of the center line. And what I'm going to do is start with the terminator line here on the side of her forehead. And again, I'm not looking to shade, doing a lot of shading. I'm not shading with the pencil yet. Really what I'm going to be looking to do first is to map out these shadow shapes with angled lines. And I can always check myself with vertical alignment as well. So the shadow shape is going to go through the bridge of her brow, the brow form. It's going to go into the bottom of her lid, down in here. Okay. It's going to cut back this way. Along the cheek, down the side plane of her face like this. This is the side plane of her face. Back this way and down to her chin. So this shadow is also, remember that whole head like an egg is going to have a terminator line that's going from the tippy top of her head all the way down her body. It's going to keep going. Cast shadow. Okay. And cast shadow continuing over the her neck and her drapery, the drapery of her neck, which is here. And then also on this side of her arm, she has a shadow shape as well. So again, not looking for any detail, but just really finding the terminator line on the deltoid. Now with her lips, what I would recommend doing for those is the same way that we found kind of like a V shape for between her eyebrows. I think of the top of the lip as along the philtrum as having a V shape as well. There's going to be a relationship from the front plane of her forehead, front plane of her nose, front plane here. A nice relationship along this way that gives you a sense of where her philtrum would live. Center of the lip. I'm going to then look for where the corner of her mouth is lining up vertically. And where I see it is with the corner of her eye. So let's pull that down to here, right there. And then this corner lining up right about here. Okay, so to finish up with the idea of shadow shapes, the overall shadow shape on her lip is going to be on this side, okay, as well as coming through the bottom lip as well, coming down this way and back to the chin. So what I'm going to very lightly do is shade the beginning. This is kind of like a ghost shading, what we call a ghost shading of her shadow shapes. So very lightly, again with the 2H pencil, I'm just going to shade this in to get it started. I am not differentiating in value between her hair just yet and her the shadow side of her face. I'm going to treat it all very much the same. And if I come in here, if I do that to all the shadows with a 2H pencil, you'll start to see the beginnings of her portrait start, okay? So the next demo, that's, this is pretty much week 1's assignment, which is to get a sense of proportion, action, proportion, and the separation of light and shadow in a very light, gently mapped out way. What I didn't do, which I will do before we sign off, is to show you how to find out the placement of her ears. So using horizontal alignment, I can see that the bottom of this lobe lines up at about the top of her lip, and the top of her ear lines up with the lash. So I'm going to map it out that way. On the other side, because of the tilt of her head, the top of her ear is lining up here a little bit more, and the bottom of the lobe is lining up more with the bottom of her lip here. Okay? And it should match that same action and tilt that we see of all the other features. And with the ears, what I'm going to do is, again, just use very simple angled lines for now to map out the outside shape and proportion of the ears. I'm not looking for any kind of detail. And then I can finish out the angle and direction of her hair. Okay? So I'm going to leave it there for now, guys, until next time when we further our drawing. But this is a pretty good place. If you can get this far in week 1, you're doing great. Good luck.